Well, this might be the wrong crowd to pitch this presentation to because you guys know so much and women know so much, but I was fascinated with it. And like all good presentations, at least to me, I learned a lot. So we'll try. So the slide speaks for itself. I think that the thing that got me started on this is I think there's way too much superficial acknowledgement of the romance and the lore of the East-West game. And that's true of the All-Star game too. Lots of happy horse shit, it's tall stories, some of which have a percentage of truth, most of which are burnished beyond recognition by the time you hear them. And so I thought I would actually check and see how the games were similar, which since they started in the same year and they ran, depending on when you count the East-West game, I mean, I'm only going through 1950 through the major Negro League era. And I started when it was 1948, so I actually have a table that differentiates between the two. So as we all know, the East-West game was the dominant event in black baseball, and the All-Star game, where I think most of us here are old enough to remember when it was a really big deal. Major League Baseball had for decades called it one of their jewel events, which is at the level of the World Series and the League Championship Series, although now it's absolutely clear that it's not. I mean, if anything, the Home Run Derby is probably bigger than the All-Star game when you look at the wretched ratings. This is true of other leagues too. The Pro Bowl, the NBA All-Star game, they've had trouble. Baseball, in my view, had a game that had integrity and tradition until interleague play, and that's what's destroyed the attraction of the All-Star game, no surprise. Of course, one of the key differences was the Negro Leagues divided their players up by region and not by league, partly because, as we know, there's only one major Negro League in the early years of the East-West game. Though it's still, I think, an interesting concept. This is a very big distinction. Comiskey Park became the home of the East-West game, though there were 5 games played outside Comiskey in different years, not consecutively, and they weren't all at the same site. Most of them were not successful. And there were North-South All-Star games, and there are all sorts of games that were announced. This was the big one, and that's the one I'm going to compare to the AL-NL game. So one of the things I looked at was players and pitchers used by year and by team. I had originally intended to compare roster limits, the number of players on the roster. I spent a good chunk of a day trying to figure out the actual rosters for the 1949 and 1950 East-West games. It took me at that time, I'm still not 100% confident I've got it right. So I abandoned that topic, or that fork, and decided just to go with players used. I think you'll see that there's not a lot of difference, although there is substantial difference between the AL and the NL in terms of pitchers used and players used. I'm not clear why. Maybe the NL just had, more of a habit of pinch hitting, and the AL didn't want to take their, immobile sluggers out of the lineup. But I think this is strikingly similar between the East-West and the AL-NL, with the allowance for lower rosters or smaller rosters. I don't know what the roster sizes are for every year. I'm sure they're smaller, but I thought this was illuminating. And the fact that both East and West use the same number of pitches per game, average, and almost the same number of players is striking to me, because the teams, in some years are very different. This is another comparison, runs and home runs per game. I was surprised to see the East-West game had higher scoring, and not surprised to see had many fewer home runs. But it is a combination you wouldn't expect, I think, that you would have 40% of the home runs of the AL-NL game and still have 10% higher scoring. I think that's mostly due to the big blowouts in the East-West game, but I didn't try to parse it past that. Here we have a close game and blowout chart. As you can see, many more close games in the AL-NL. I'd use a different definition than Baseball Reference. 1 to 2 runs for close games plus any extra inning game, and a blowout of 6 runs or more, not including extra innings. So both leagues had few blowouts by my definition, and the Negro leagues didn't have as many close games in this period. On the other hand, most of the games that weren't within 1 or 2 runs were within 3 or 4 runs, certainly within the range that in the 8th or 9th inning you could figure your team could win. So I don't see a real difference here either, a meaningful difference. Balance of power, one of my favorite topics. When I was a kid, I couldn't understand why the AL team got it, got the piss beaten out of it every single year. So AL NL record, AL won 12 of the first 17, but the longer streak was only 4. And of course, we know the NL would go on to, make hamburger out of the AL in the 50s and 60s because of the slow pace, the all deliberate speed the AL integrated with. East-West record, to my surprise, was virtually even. And there you find a lot of comments in the literature about the games and the teams. Like, I don't know how the East team is ever going to win another game with this kind of lineup and that kind of stuff. So apparently, while people had ideas that one region or the other, East or West, was dominant or would be dominant, it really didn't play out, at least during this period. I really didn't look at the games in the 50s. They're minor league games. I don't care much about them. So as I mentioned, there were 5 East-West games played outside of Chicago, always won at Comiskey. We know that the American League and National League had this ill-fated experiment from 59 to 62 to bolster the players' pension fund. It did not work out well, although there's a surprise there. And neither of the plan to double up were successful. The Negro Leagues implemented it haphazardly. I didn't try to look up the individual reasons for each year that they had a second game. So here's my decisions. And this is because many people say, and I just read it this morning in an article about the East-West game, that the East-West game often outdrew the AL-NL game, or people just say outdrew it without any qualifications, and neither is true. The East-West game did not often outdraw the AL-NL game, nor did they outdraw it on very often. They did outdraw it a couple of times. So the way I looked at it is, if you have 2 sellouts, you can't tell who drew more because the ballpark capacities aren't good. You have many years where the AL-NL game is at Fenway Park, for example, or Wrigley Field. You can't fit as many people into there as Comiskey. If they sell out, you have no idea what they would have sold if they had a venue as big as Comiskey. If neither team sold out, it's an easy comparison. But if one team sold out, if the team with a lower attendance sold out, I think you can't make a judgment because you don't know if they could have sold, how many more tickets they could have sold. That's a key thing when you're comparing, especially in the war years. That's where people make this misleading comparison, because you had some years where the East-West game was in Comiskey, a very large venue, and the AL-NL game wasn't. But the AL-NL game sold out, and therefore it's not a straight comparison in my view. Just can't make a judgment. And then they're, of course, not applicable. All the non-Comiskey games, I didn't have anything to compare them to. I wouldn't compare them to the AL-NL game. It wouldn't have been fair. And then we know the AL-NL game was canceled in 45. So here is my big table, which gives all the deets on these games. I should have thought to highlight the decisions on the yeses, but I think the screen is big enough you can pick them out. I was thinking I would have a pointer, and I should have realized I wouldn't. So I think this is pretty interesting. I used a proprietary database that I developed on ballparks, including capacity, which has been sold to Baseball Reference, as well as cross-checked against the Seamheads database, which is also very good. Sometimes they have a mistake, and sometimes we have a mistake, and I catch it by looking at them. So I'm pretty confident in those capacity figures. There is 1 year here that the capacity, it's a Crossley Field year, where the game was listed as a sellout, and both we and Seamheads had the capacity in the 30s, and I knew something was wrong. The reason you can get a sellout with fewer tickets sold than the capacity is that, of course, they give away tickets to VIPs. They also frequently have a media section in the grandstand if the press box isn't adequate, and I presume back then it wasn't adequate in all cases, that can take up hundreds of seats. So that you can't be sure that if you're a few hundred or even more than 1,000 short of capacity, you have a sellout, that you don't have a sellout. But in this case, I think I identified that by cross-checking our data against Seamheads that Crosley Field expanded that year, but not before the All-Star game, because I read several accounts that this game was a sellout. Anyway, so I'm pretty confident in my judgments. And you see here, there's only 1 year prior to World War II where it's clear that the East-West game definitively outdrew the ALNO game. The attendance at that Braves Field game was atrocious, and there was speculation in the media about it, but no one seems to really have a good grip on why the attendance was so low. Here we have World War II, which of course is a special era, and this is where the East-West game shines in terms of comparison to the ALNO game. They had the East-West game had 3 consecutive sellouts and clearly outdrew the Major League game twice. I was very surprised by the poor attendance at the ALNO game during World War II. I don't understand that. I do understand the good attendance at the East-West game. Neil Langto and many other smart Negro League scholars and historians have said that with the onset of the war economy, even before World War II, African Americans were getting jobs they couldn't get during the Depression. And that rippled through the economy and gave them more discretionary money. And the Negro Leagues began to thrive during the war, not just after the war. And so I understand the robust attendance at the East-West game. I don't understand the poor attendance at the ALNO game. Here we have the post-war attendance up to 1950. This sort of goes back to the pattern. The Negro League games does very well, but it does not often outsell or outdraw the Major League game if you're looking at a fair comparison. Now this is the results, the scoreboard. So I originally was doing 33 to 48, and I extended it to 1950. If I started on this later, I would have just done the 1950. But you can see the East-West game legitimately outdrew the ALNO game 3 times and didn't outdraw it 8 times through 1950. That's pretty decisive in my view if you're comparing them. And then I break it down by era, and you can see there's a large number of inconclusive games, which is to be expected. There's just no way to know when you sell out of a field where you're turning away 500 people, you could have sold 10,000 more tickets. In a way, I like the ALNO plan of alternating leagues and rotating ballparks. It's a really big deal when the All-Star game came to your town. It used to be, at least. I remember when I was an undergrad and the All-Star game came to Detroit. It was a huge deal, an absolute huge deal. But I also like the idea that you have it in one place, everyone can plan, they can plan their vacation around it, and you have a big venue that everyone likes. That makes a lot of sense. I did take a look at the effect of having 2 games in 1 year. As you can see in the Negro Leagues, the non-Comiskey games are pretty much a disaster. And I'm surprised that after the first 3 that they even attempted them in 47 and 48. But I guess that's because the economy was booming and the Negro Leagues were doing well until, reintegration tore them apart. But I mean, think of having a East-West game with all those All-Stars and Hall of Famers, future Hall of Famers, and drawing 18,000 people in Yankee Stadium. But it was the second game, and the big game was in Chicago. As I note that the Comiskey game was played earlier, all but 1 year, and the games were 2 to 3 days apart. Another thing that I think is questionable. I think doing them 2 to 3 days apart probably hurts attendance, but who knows? But the 39 game was 3 weeks apart. And then I made a note, partly because I wanted some illustration here. I had this cool little patch that the game 2 and 61 was the first rain out, 1-1 tie. I would have thought that it would have been better to stage the games if you're going to have two games like a month apart, but only only in 39 did they do that. And the American League National League game, I don't think anyone really liked it, even though the attendance on that was much better than I thought. I thought I was going to see figures like the East-West game, but the attendance wasn't that bad, yet they ditched it. I think it was unpopular all around. Okay, so Rich is telling me I'm 5 minutes out. So conclusions with a dropped S. Didn't even notice that. So it's amazing how many times I look at these slides. I was emailing poor Cassidy at, just before lunch saying, oh, I found corrections in here and other people pointed out things. Can you load the new thing? I didn't even notice that dropped S. Okay, so these games are obviously brilliant promotions, brilliant things for fans, good for the owners, good for the players. And they were produced by visionary men. I know the one person, one great man theory certainly isn't true with the East-West game, although Greenlee gets the credit as the primary promoter. But I think that no matter how you slice and dice it, these were great ideas. It certainly contributed to longevity and the health of the Negro Leagues. As I said, the MLB for decades, they still listed as one of their jewel events. It's just that the jewel has sort of fallen out of the crown. And the only things, in my view, and there are better historians of African American history than me here, the only thing that I can tell ever achieved this kind of success and the kind of prominence were the heavyweight bouts of Joe Louis and the gold medal performance of Jesse Owens. And to me, that's just, astonishing, because baseball games by their very nature are not special events like football games or whatever. So in my view, the East-West game transcends all the other events because it's not episodic. I mean, it's episodic, but it's scheduled regularly and it's part of a long season, which defines baseball. It was smart for the Negro Leagues to put it in Chicago, and I think that was one of the key reasons to make it what it is. As we know, the East-West Classic overshadowed the postseason play in the Negro Leagues for many, many reasons. And my conclusion is this was a great thing in Negro League history. It is justifiably celebrated. We shouldn't be embellishing the history by saying things like that aren't true, that it outdrew the AL-NL All-Star game. I think it was fully equal to the AL-NL All-Star game. I think that in the universe of black baseball, it was more important, but it was fully equal in every other sense. And they were surprisingly similar to me. Selected sources, of course. But I still use books. Larry Lester's book is a terrific resource. The David Vincent, Lyle Smith, David Smith book still is also a good resource. I don't think not quite as good on the top as Larry's second edition. I still use my own ESPN Baseball Encyclopedia for stuff like this because we had a nice summary of the Negro League section about the East-West games, and I refer to it a lot of times rather than just simply looking on the web. Newspapers, you're going to know all these. There's nothing I'm telling you about this. And that's the end. I apologize for the misspelling on Joe Louis. I can't believe I looked at this thing. I had to look at this thing 50 times and I didn't see it. And then of course I'm up here and I'm seeing this and I'm going. So other than dissing me for the horrible goof on Joe Louis and the dropped S's, you're welcome to email me. You can also buttonhole me and get my phone number, and then you can call and yell at me later. And there's self-promotion for Hamtramck Stadium, which I spend most of my time on these days. That's the end.
Few few minutes for questions.
So the years that there were multiple games and the non-Comiskey games didn't do as well for the East West, do you think that that's because since it was so established, it was like the other spots were clearly All-Star Game B to the fans, whereas like in the major leagues, those 3 years they did that, there was no A or B, right? It was just 2 sites.
Well, I don't know if there was an A or B. To me, when I remember looking years ago at the rosters of the 2 games, it seemed to me the first game in sequence in the AL-NL series was always had a better roster. There were players in the first game that were not in the second game. And while the second game rosters weren't chopped liver, they weren't as good.
Okay.
And I also dimly remember those games, and I don't remember there being as much excitement. I mean, generally, you're just not going to have excitement over the second in a series because it's not like there's a best of 3. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just think it was a bad idea on both parts. The Negro Leagues might have done better by saying we're going to have a second game in Yankee Stadium every year, but they probably couldn't guarantee that because of the way, you know. Also, I should have mentioned the Negro Leagues games were later in the season. Almost all of them were in August. A few were, there was one in September, maybe more than one. Whereas I think and that was because, I presume, because of the original thing where Greenlee and the Negro Leagues picked it up from Arch Ward in the Major League, which no dishonor in stealing somebody's good idea. But I think that the game was probably too late in the season, and therefore having a second game after that made it even worse. That's a guess, you know. Alan?
The issue with the Negro League attendance, the Chicago game, as you said, was the social event of the season for Black America. Everybody traveled there. It's not as if they drew 50,000 people from Chicago. They drew it from all over the country. So for people to make a second trip to New York or Washington, even to Cleveland, would be a hardship. So it's the pool from which you were drawing the people that caused the attendance to dip in the second games in those years.
Right. I think that's reasonable speculation. I haven't actually tried to verify that. I also wanted to point out that the Comiskey Park game was an instant success in terms of what they were trying to achieve, but the attendance was not the 50,000 packing it into Comiskey that people say. People act like it started out with 50,000 people in Comiskey. It didn't. It grew reasonably quickly, but not exponentially. And then it also slumped pretty quickly in the late 40s. Tom?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest surprises to me when I started doing the record sheet was the fact that they actually managed to pull off an East-West game in 1945, whereas there wasn't an AL. Do you have any insight as to how the Negro League got around the travel to whatever, the reasons?
Well, I did not attempt to research that. I spent a lot of time on this. I don't know if it shows, but I spent a lot of time as I dropped several things, like trying to figure out the actual roster sizes of all the Negro Leagues. And I'm going to do that, but it's going to take me longer. I don't think the AL-NL, they weren't ordered not to play. They simply decided not to use their travel coupon, so to speak, or their travel credit up that way. And I presume that was because they felt it wasn't, the owners felt it wasn't worth it. Whereas in the Negro Leagues, this was a big boost to the exchequer. And I figured that whatever travel restrictions they're operating under, tires or gasoline or railroad miles used or whatever they were operating under, this was still worth it, because they were not going to get this kind of return from almost any league game or any exhibition game, other exhibition game. But I did not dig into that. I promised him.
Do we know how the gate receipts were shared between the owners of Comiskey and the Negro Leagues?
I believe it was just a flat rental fee for Comiskey, and then the gate receipts were shared. But Larry Lesher's book has all those details. He literally has the financial reports for those games. That's one of the things that makes it a great resource. Phil?
I have a question. Well, actually, I probably have a statement. With the East-West game, what's unique is that those were predominantly African-American crowds.
Right.
Which is, when you go to baseball parks these days, you don't see those kind of crowds. And I think that's unique, that even though maybe they didn't exceed that in some years, it was the number of African-Americans in those crowds showing the love for baseball.
Sure, and of course we know that white people back then weren't smart enough to appreciate the great quality of baseball and the Negro Leagues, And therefore the white percentage of crowds at black games that weren't, where Satchel Paige wasn't advertised a pitch was very small. Right, I agree.
One more question.
All right. I guess Duke's gonna get it because he's closer and I don't see any hands, but I'm having trouble seeing up in the back. Go ahead, Duke.
So what stuck out to me looking at those 2 game years is the 47 game and the Polo Grounds actually had not much of a decline in attendance, that 38,000 people attended that one. I don't know if you looked at that one in particular, but that just stuck out to me, that clearly that was a very popular game. And
Yeah.
I wonder, I'm just thinking 1947, Jackie Robinson, did that have anything to do with it? Even though he was playing,
I guess, I mean,
now.
it's reasonable speculation. Again, I just didn't have time to do that. You would think that if the Polo Grounds did well, Yankee Stadium would do well, but
Right.
look at Yankee Stadium. On the other hand, the Polo Grounds was a national league and it was the league, the American League was still we don't need to integrate. We don't need no stinking black people, so. All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you.